My hometown is 97.63% white. I know that this graphic seems gratuitous, right? It's just a big monocolored blob, basically. But that's exactly what it is. Now, I'm obviously part of that just mass of blue. And because of this, I have a great deal of privilege, both just as a white citizen in this country, but also as a scientist. I am a social psychologist, and I'm interested in race. I'm interested in race, but many of the things I study about race, I don't actually have to experience myself. I never have, and I probably never will. So the fact that for me, race and racial biases can be an interest and not the reality of my everyday life is a massive privilege. People in my field often joke that research is me-search. Basically, that social psychologists end up studying what we've always just wondered about our social selves. And it wasn't until I started intensely studying the psychology of racism that this clicked. I began noticing the biases I was researching in other people in my own thoughts and feelings and behavior. From my studies, I had learned that although sometimes we're not aware of it, racial biases can be deeply ingrained within us. By this point, I had learned this from a scientific standpoint, but it was really the first time that I realized that I had probably been this way my entire life. Growing up, my family and I would visit New York City several times a year. I loved these trips because I just adored the reality of a circle that wasn't 98% blue. But my most vivid memory from these trips that I loved is a moment that's always really bothered me, and a moment I still think about all the time. I was 8 or so, and one day my family and I were taking a walk in Central Park. Walking behind us on the path was a black man, and he was wearing a bright orange puffy vest. That's it. That's all the information. But I was scared. I was really scared, and I thought we were in danger. And you know what? It was probably obvious to the man that I was thinking this about him. Long before I started studying race, I would think about the situation, and it would really bother me. It bothered me because it confused me. I've certainly never thought of myself as racist, and in fact, it's always been very important to me that I'm not, but how I acted in that moment was racist. It wasn't until I started studying race that I began to understand how racism isn't always obvious. What does this mean? It means that the stereotypes perpetuated in society about different races can lodge themselves deep in our minds. They can affect how we think and how we act, even if we're not aware of it. That is what I study, that we often react very differently to people of other races compared to people of our own race, even if we don't notice. I specifically study this related to reactions related to empathy. For example, I look at how we react to watching other people of a different race than us in physical pain. And I'm far from the only one who does this. A study that was published in 2012 found that people think that blacks experience far less physical pain than whites in the same exact situations. 2 years after this study was published, Eric Garner was killed by compression of the neck and chest, a chokehold, by a white NYPD officer. While this was happening and he was lying on the sidewalk, Eric stated 11 times, "I can't breathe." When Eric lost consciousness, the EMTs came, but they didn't perform CPR on him at the scene. He was pronounced dead shortly after this. How does this relate to race, and how does it relate to empathy? Well, to answer these questions, we have to take some steps back. So, what is empathy? Empathy is an emotional response that stems from the comprehension of the person's situation and which is similar to what the other person is feeling. Okay. Well, this is saying both a lot and nothing at the same exact time. So let's try this one. Empathy is experiencing another person's state as your own. And let's just try and demonstrate that right now. Ready? Watch.
Oh.
He's fine. So, how did you feel? You might have had some tingling in your feet, maybe your heart started pounding a bit, a little shortness in your breath? If so, that was all you, to some degree, experiencing the tightrope walker, a stranger's state as though it were your own, despite your very obvious awareness that you weren't actually up on that rope yourself. The science on what makes it possible for our brains and our bodies to do this is really complex, and it's a process that's been developing over thousands and thousands of years. But what you just experienced was empathy in its purest form, experiencing another person's state as though it were your own. Now, at some point, empathy became actually kind of necessary for human survival, as we gradually evolved into a species that's really dependent on one another. And because of this, empathy can often be pretty effortless and automatic. It didn't take a lot of work for many of you to feel the effects of watching just 10 seconds of someone on a rope over a cliff, and it probably doesn't take much work for you in a lot of situations either. You want to test this out? Go to YouTube, type in "marriage proposal fails," and see how long you last. But empathy doesn't actually occur as often or as easily as we might think it does. There are a lot of situations in which people fail to feel empathy. And this goes far beyond the kind of classic case of like a psychopath, for example, because we actually all do it all the time. Now, failures of empathy can be particularly powerful in situations with people that belong to different groups or group contexts. Now, as a point of clarity, group context can refer to situations with different groups of people, or it can refer to situations with just a couple people that have different group identities. And we don't have to look very hard at all for examples of this in our lives. The world of sports is a really great area for this and has actually been looked at in a few scientific investigations. One study recruited fans from a local soccer team as participants. And in the study, they watched either a fellow fan or a fan of their rival team receive painful electric shocks. And they were given 3 options for how to react to watching the other fan receive painful electric shocks. 1, they could choose to help the person by taking some of the shocks themselves. 2, they could choose to not help the person and watch a video to distract them from the whole thing. Or 3, they could not help the person, but also actively choose to watch the other person in pain getting shocked. So what happened? Well, not surprisingly, the fans chose to help their fellow fans much more than their rival fans, but they also actively chose to watch their rival fans in pain getting shocked. Now, as this was happening, the brain activity of the participants was being monitored. And one thing their brain activity showed was that an area called the nucleus accumbens was being activated, that little green area up there. This is an area of the brain that's involved in feeling pleasure. But it's specifically been shown to be involved when people are feeling pleasure from the misfortunes of others. So, stated very bluntly, what this study suggests is that the fans were feeling actual pleasure from their rival fans' pain. So, okay, why does this really matter? Well, I wouldn't be talking to you if the reaches of failed empathy ended at sports rivalries. But you can imagine that if something like this can happen with groups that are kind of trivial, how powerful it could be with groups that are not at all trivial. What the research on sports does is reflect strikingly similar patterns of behavior between groups more significant and consequential to our society. Now let's return back to the Eric Garner case. The patterns of behavior I'm about to discuss, they go often like this. It's way too much work for us to carefully kind of figure out every single person that we encounter on an everyday basis. So instead, what we often do with our brains is we analyze the people around us based on information that we already have. Let's just call this information stereotypes. You had to see that coming. So what we do all the time, every day, as we navigate our worlds, is zone in on cues that tell us a little something about what groups a person might belong to. This person on the tee has a Red Sox hat, but that person at the bank has a Yankees hat. This woman on the phone sounds like she has an American accent, but that woman on the phone sounds like she has a different accent. This person looks black, and that person looks white. But the pattern doesn't stop here. Our brains then take these cues that alert us to someone's group, and it activates the stereotypes that we have about that group. This information is then used to direct how we will think about this person and how we will act towards this person, including how much empathy for this person we're ultimately going to feel. So despite the fact that Eric stated 11 times, "I can't breathe," he died from a chokehold by a white NYPD officer. Now, maybe the officer couldn't easily recognize the pain Eric was in as well as he could have with a white man. Or maybe the officer's stereotypes about black men, that they're dangerous, motivated him to downplay Eric's pain and instead act more forcefully than he would have with a white man. I could talk all day about these possibilities and the role of empathy from the perspective of the police officer. But most, if not all of us, are not police officers. So is it even fair for me to try and relate the Eric Garner case to all of us? Well, the thing is, situations like these can be perpetuated in much more subtle ways by us, the public. For example, our lack of empathy for people different than us can prompt us to make justifications about the bad situations that people are in. Justifications about the police officer's actions, for example. Eric was selling illegal cigarettes. I mean, he was doing something wrong, right? Justifications like these can perpetuate the narratives and the stereotypes and the violence against entire groups of people. These thought patterns can be so hard to recognize. In fact, they can occur in our brains before we even have the ability to notice. So I don't think I need to explain to you that addressing deeply ingrained racial biases is a daunting and ambiguous thing. But I think a digestible first step is to simply try to recognize. Recognize that you might react to people of other races very differently than people of your own race, like how much empathy for someone of another race that you feel. Consider that this might happen much more often than you think it does. Recognize that even if you aren't aware of your thoughts and your feelings and even your actions in the moment, that they can still have an impact. If you find yourself walking in front of a black man in Central Park, reflect on how you react and trace the origin of that reaction. I know that these seem like very small steps for a very large problem, and they certainly can't fix everything. But recognition by many can ultimately lead to behavioral change by an entire society. I just want to take a moment to tell you all how lucky I feel to be able to talk to you about this today. As a scientist, the opportunities to get to share my work with you, the public, are pretty rare. My days are often spent in front of screens, staring at numbers and charts and graphs that take a really long time to understand. And it can be years before anything even resembling progress is made. But I care a lot about these topics. And the whole reason many of my colleagues and I got into the field of social psychology is to produce good science that will reach and help all of us, the public. I'd like to end by returning to privilege. I know that it's become a cliched kind of buzzword lately, right? But it's become that for good reason. Privilege is power, so it is so important how we use it. There are many of us, myself being one, who are privileged enough to be able to talk about these topics without experiencing backlash against our own racial identity, or who are privileged enough to not be labeled too sensitive by starting a discussion on race. Use this. Start discussions with people who share this privilege. Try to push past how uncomfortable it might be and how vulnerable you might feel. Try to challenge yourself. I know that I'm talking about this right now up on a stage with mic and lights, but what I really want is this to be taken as a conversation between you and me. I have started this conversation with you. Go out and continue it with others. Thank you.